This is the Whippersnappers podcast, a youthful perspective on science fiction and fantasy with our hosts, me, Corey McCleery, and Anthony Marchetta. Unfortunately, the third member of our disreputable gang, April Freeman, could not be joining us. I would like to congratulate her and Pierce Oka on their upcoming nuptials, leaving us, the other two of us, all alone here. Anyway, we're here to talk about something rather geekish. We're basically, I'm gonna just, for all the one viewer watching, I'm going to lay out what this stream is about. We're going to be geeking about two different types of anime. Before I go further, I do want to warn everyone, this is going to be very, very spoilerific. Seriously, the two anime we're reviewing, Gurren Lagann, Fullmetal Alchemist, Brotherhood, they're both on Netflix. Go binge to your heart's content. I promise you, we're not snobs. We will not judge if you go dub or sub. Just go watch them before this, because we're going in deep, and we're not going to be trying to avoid spoilers.
Honestly, with Brotherhood especially, I'd even recommend the dub over the sub.
Anthony, now you've doomed us all.
Sorry, dub is absolutely fantastic, though. You could even see it. Actually, the translations is even very good, which is surprising.
You do know that the legion of anime snobs are going to come after you. You have.
I'm not afraid. I think it's the right call. I'm making a stand.
That's the hill you want to die on.
That, Cowboy Bebop, and maybe Escaflowne, maybe Vision of Escaflowne, but that's another story. Moving on.
Yes. Well, I should say that I got Anthony into Fullmetal Alchemist just as a little bit of backstory, and yeah, there's a bit of the hump because there's that, I think it's like the third episode where they go to that place with the weird priest, and I know you weren't much of a fan of that, but like,
it grew on me later on because I watched the video that it did grow. Go ahead.
You basically came back like a week later. It's like, yeah, this is one of my favorite shows, not anime shows. I'm like, I told you. It's very awesome, very well paced. And then you kept badgering me into Gurren Lagann, and to be honest, much more entertaining than studying for midterms. And I still got good grades on the midterms. So
that's impressive.
Yeah, everything worked out in the end. But yeah, we basically both got into that, and one of the things that, at least in my case, there are a lot of people who are fans of anime just in general, as fans of the medium. I'm not one of those. I'm more of the story kind of guy. There's some people who really love the art style and love just all the stuff that usually gets thrown on, the trappings and stuff. That's not really me. It's not that I tolerate the art style. I'm just more generally neutral on it. If it has a good story, I'll watch it. Sometimes if it's way too stylistically rendered, it will like give me a headache, and I'm like, I won't be able to watch this because it just looks ridiculous.
Well, here's what I'll say about anime. Originally, I was recommended a lot of shows, and if you're part of the Superversive group, and let's face it, we're all geeks here. In the Superversive
group who want to make their living off of writing science fiction and fantasy, geeks? Color me surprised.
I know. Yeah, they recommended a lot of anime to me, and I was never really that into trying it out, but I tried. I think the first one that I tried was Cowboy Bebop, and I realized something as I was going through it, that it's really a shame how America has blocked off so many movies by only limiting animation to either kids shows or. Hold on, my computer's wigging out on me a little. There we go. It's working. Anyway, the fact that it limits itself so much, it's really a shame when you see you hear a lot from people. Anime does have a lot of dross. It has a lot of bad shows, and probably the majority of their shows are bad. They're all mostly anyway tie-ins to other media. They're not all going to be good, which is fair enough. But it's the sheer variety of what you will see in anime that you just don't see in Western animation. I mean, so many different possibilities for stories that they just don't tell here.
Mm-hmm.
And both Gurren Lagann and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, I think, are very accessible to a Western audience. Because Gurren Lagann, even though, it has the mechs and everything, which is very Japanese, but even in that, it's a space opera. And space opera is an American
Pacific
genre.
Rim was a pretty big hit here.
Right.
I don't know about the latest movie, but yeah. And Fullmetal Alchemist actually takes place in a more westernized setting, which is some of the issues. Like I've seen people talk about some anime and how you have to have a passing influence of Japanese culture because they do play on if you've heard the phrase a novel of manners or a comedy of manners, there are things like something like Jane Austen would write where you have to know the intricacies of different social settings for you to get the joke. It's not like slapstick where it's just automatically funny because it's funny. That's low, crude humor, but it's also accessible. And as such, Gurren Lagann and Fullmetal Alchemist don't really have that kind of, I guess, barrier to entry.
Learning curve.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I agree with you on that animation thing, and I also take it that one of the few places where America should imitate the French is their comics industry. Because if you look at American comics, we almost instantaneously think of superheroes, which is, it's not even a genre of fiction, it's a subgenre. I guess you could almost classify it as a type of a subgenre of science fiction or fantasy or a mixture of both.
While something in that realm.
Right. While
definitely,
you have,
it's definitely somewhere in that realm.
And those are the big hitters from Marvel and DC, and you kind of have almost an oligopoly with them, and then you've got Image, IDW, some other comic industries as well. But
Dark Horse, I believe.
Yeah.
Dark Horse is one.
Mm-hmm. And I believe Valiant Comics, it's what one of our guys, John De La Rose, keeps pushing me to read Exo Man of War, which, to be fair, does sound interesting. I just have no money.
Out for like $7, I think. And All Hero was very good.
Right, and that's
I'll plug it very briefly because I did like it. And I wouldn't, here's the thing, I wouldn't say anything if I didn't like it. I wouldn't mention it at all. Mm-hmm. And I did like it. The art style was simplistic. The art could maybe improve, but when you compare it to what Marvel is putting out, it's head and shoulders above. And the story was interesting. It had a good element of satire, but it wasn't as in your face as some people might be worried about. And the story, there's definitely, you want to keep following. So I recommend Alt Hero. It was a good comic.
All right, yeah, but the like one of the things is, there's a series of books. They're not terribly superversive, but I mean the author has an excellent economy of language and a very good grasp of prose, and he just knows how to shove weird stuff into a book. And it's the Elric Saga by Michael Moorcock. I have the first 3 volumes, and he had an adaptation by a French comic group. I forget what it was, but the first one's called Elric the Ruby Throne, and the second one's called Stormbringer, and they're the first 2 parts of the first book. And they were excellently done. Mind you, it's centered around his homeland, and his homeland is basically the kind of place that you would look at this place and be like, okay, God, send a flood, send Noah's flood, because these people need to be wiped out because they're all ridiculously just gross and nasty, which is part of how the novel doesn't go into those depths, but because it's a more visual medium, comic does. But France has much more heterogeneous comic genres. It has cyberpunk comics. It's got fantasy stuff, slice of life. It's pretty much got everything. In the same way that what's its face? Japan also has that situation. They're the kind of the three big comics companies: America, Japan, and France. But anyway, let's stop gushing about the medium. Yeah, and we'll get back on to the first of the two, Gurren Lagann.
Yeah, Gurren Lagann, I think. What you can say about it, one of the reasons
it's so a little overcap of the basic plot line.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Gurren Lagann is the story of Kamina and Simone, and they live in an underground city, and Kamina believes in a place above the ground called the surface, and everybody thinks he's insane.
Yeah, that's until a giant mech decides to just drop through the ceiling and proceed to wreck everything.
Well, then Simone, who is Kamina's best friend, and he calls him, and they're like blood brothers. They call each other bro. Simone, who is much more timid than Kamina, but who admires him very much, when he's drilling through the ground, finds the head of a mech that looks something almost like a samurai sword. And when he gets inside, it leads him and Kamina to the surface, where they find a land under attack by giant robots. And that is the premise of Gurren Lagann.
Yep, and I mean that sounds like a kind of general mech thing, and you might be thinking, wait, you said this was a space opera. It is a space opera, as a matter of fact. But that gets into the second half, where there's a definite shift in tone between the first and second half of the anime.
I would say even before the half mark, because, one of the things, it's sort of like, and I'm going to get into a Death Note spoiler too, but we warned that there would be spoilers of things. But anyway, one of the things is like the death of L in Death Note, that everything, the tone, the idea, everything kind of changes, because the first, maybe third of Gurren Lagann is it's like on the edge of a parody. It's like balanced on the edge of parody and legitimate mech show. Like they have that great scene early on where Kamina yells, "We're going to combine!"
Yeah, and he just kind of shoves the guy into it.
Yeah, and everybody watching is going, "What the hell is he doing? Why does he think that will work?" And then it works.
Yeah, that's kind of.
They're like, "That makes no sense."
But
fantastic. But
yeah,
go ahead.
When I said it changes, I mean it literally changes in the aesthetics and the feel of it, because it starts off as kind of like the scruffy resistance fighters against this overwhelming army of beastmen living inside these giant. They're called gunmen, the gigantic mechs. Yeah. And then the second one switches over to like a futuristic society where, everything's going great, and then everything stops going great.
Yeah, they have the death of Kamina, I think, is really what everybody will think of. And first off, that's probably my favorite episode of the show, even though Kamina is a great character, because it was executed so well. His death scene. Kamina, the best thing you could say, the most about Kamina, is that he got up and avenged his own death. And I think that is like the essence of Kamina right there. Mm-hmm. He gets attacked, it looks as if he dies, and then he wakes up, avenges his own death, and dies again. And that's Kamina right there. But after that point in the show, Kamina was kind of the thing that put it on that border of the parody and the mech show, and the humor remains. But after that point, it gets a lot darker.
Yeah,
good.
Oh yeah,
it might even be better. And I mean, both halves were good, but
the second half of I shouldn't say the second half, because it doesn't occur in the halfway mark. The post Kamina's death, one of the things that they did really well was Kamina always seemed to have this ridiculously wild and ridiculously almost outlandish personality, but there's actual depth to him. And the way that they showed that was that they ripped him out, and then they had everyone start falling apart in different ways to show all the different relationships he had with characters. Everyone from
Simone to
Yoko to Simone. Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it's not like everyone was just grieving. They were all doing it in a different way that showed what they basically did was they showed how he supported everyone by ripping him out and seeing how everyone would start falling apart.
Well, what was great about it, what I really loved, and the contrast, you could contrast it to Shinji, is that from Neon Genesis Evangelion, and Gurren Lagann, in a lot of ways, was almost like a way to take back the mech genre from the shadow that Neon Genesis Evangelion left on the genre. And the main character of Shinji, one of the big criticisms of the show is that he's always complaining and he's always whining, and he slowly goes basically insane as the show goes on and more depressed. And Simone, after Kamina's death, is clearly depressed, really depressed. He's clearly upset. It's affecting him visibly, and it's even affecting his job. You know, he's not doing as good of a job. But what's great about what they do is it's harder for him to do his job, and he's not doing it as well. But he doesn't give up. He tries. He gets back into Lagann. He goes into the fight, and he's failing because he's trying to emulate Kamina, and he's just not the same person. And then that's when Nia shows up, and what Nia does is show that Simone is a hero in his own right. You know, he'll jump out, even when Lagann doesn't work for him, he'll jump out and he'll run into the middle of a giant mech fight to rescue Nia, even though he's completely outmatched. Mm-hmm. He literally is going up against giant robots with nothing, just running into the middle of a field. And what's great, though, is that they do this while still showing that Kamina's death affected them. Mm-hmm. That none of them give up, but there's a definite, it changes them.
Yeah. That's definitely something. I also, it's the other thing, and this is the rarest time I'm actually going to praise this element of a book or movie or show, where they basically just kind of say screw you to the rules of reality, where it works with this because that's kind of the whole theme of the anime.
Yeah, it goes with
most things that do that. It's usually like, I don't want to say a continuity error, but it's almost a Deus Ex Machina moment. But this is just happens, and it works, oddly enough.
Well, there are two types of shows. You could say there's the one type of show where the rules of the fairy world, and you could call them any sort of supernatural or science fiction world, just as a broad term, the fairy world, you know, the perilous realm where things are different and the rules are different. And there are kind of two types. There's one where the rules remain consistent. They're set up and then they have to be followed. Spirited Away is this type of world in its own way. You know, what G.K. Chesterton used to say, like the rules of fairyland, the physics of fairyland are moral. You know, if somebody makes a promise, they have to keep it and all of that stuff.
Right. If you know someone's true name, you know them. Therefore,
Death Note's an especially extreme example where Death Note, if the rules of the Death Note change, then the entire show falls apart because the whole thing is based on that. And then
and there's an absurd. I looked this up at one point for Death Note. There's an absurd number of rules because all these people did was like figure out like part of what I don't want to say all they did, but one of the things that the developers did was I imagine they just sat down and hashed out, okay, how exactly do these things work? Because they add, from what I understand, they add two things and then they kind of extrapolate from there. They add the Shinigami and they add the Death Notes. And they have just so well developed them that it fits and it works and it fits in with the world, because they've seen all the realistic versions of that.
And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is really like the shonen genre in a lot of, or not all shonen shows, because like a show like My Hero Academia is actually very good at sticking to its rules, but you see it in like Dragon Ball Z is almost the example, or the, if not the example, like the, you know, platonic idea of this.
Yeah.
The idea that everything's just going to get bigger and you could always pull off bigger and bigger and bigger. And sure, it's not really set up. And sure, it's not really, you know, the rules change. Everything, people can do things that you never really knew they could do before. But man, is it a lot of fun.
There's ways.
When you do it well, if you do it badly, it comes off stupid, which Dragon Ball Z honestly did a lot. But like in Gurren Lagann, they do it really well.
You first dug yourself into a hole when you said that some dubs were better than subs. Now that you've just insulted Dragon Ball Z, I'm gonna have to cut you loose and abandon you to save my own hide. I'm very sorry, Anthony. But
I've heard that. Well, in my defense, my brother tells me that Dragon Ball Z was bad, but the original Dragon Ball was a good show. So I will say that.
But but yeah, that's one of the things that I was reading through. I'm still reading through because I'm far too busy. John C Wright's Count of the Eschaton sequence, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's always been set up like that, and that's partially the difference. When the rules change, it's not because the rules need to change. It's because the main character doesn't have a full view of how everything works, and suddenly Menelaus Montrose is like, oh, that's how these things work. It's a really good series. I totally recommend it. It's the one thing I will say about it is the second book is rather slow because it's the first half of the second and third book combined. The third book is a little talking at the beginning, but then it's pretty much a 300-page fight scene, and it is glorious because what else would you call when someone, electrocutes someone using the Earth's core as a dynamo to just blast them with a freaking 100-mile radius lightning bolts?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that Count to a Trillion, which, as John C. Wright pointed out, is actually very hard sci-fi in the sense that even when it gets that big and that ridiculous, he tries very hard to stay within proven scientific principles and rules.
I think he changed one thing.
Gurren Lagann does not.
Scientific accuracy, yeah. Don't go there for Gurren Lagann. It's no. I mean, they literally have robots powered by masculine spirit.
Of will.
Yeah, will, masculine spirit. It's like, what? There's
awesome.
If you're going in this as a, like, I want to see a detailed hard SF kind of explanation of how these work.
No.
I'm going to be completely honest, you're not going to be getting it here. But that's not the point of the book.
At the end of the show, they have that awesome scene, that hilarious scene where Liron, the character of Liron, is explaining to the Gurren Lagann team. He starts trying to go into how it works. And he starts going into, it seems that the spiral energy is powered by the energy of your will or whatever, and everybody's eyes.
Will, reproduction, and desire to live. Everyone's powered by love. And everyone's like, oh.
Yeah, it goes, it's powered by, or it was something like the power of love will power the robots, and everybody cheers. And then he starts explaining again, like, it seems that your will is doing it. And then one of them cuts him off and goes, since when did we get explanations in Gurren Lagann?
Yeah.
Who cares? And I just started laughing. They were clearly making fun of themselves.
Right. And that's one of the instances where, and this is something I've noticed a lot, is you see a lot of humor shift from gags in the or something comedic in the scene to pointing out stuff in lampshade hanging. And you see this a lot with this kind of, the authors aren't treating this like it's its own contained universe. They're treating it like the guys know it's fiction and kind of just pointing out some of the absurdities of it.
With that said, I will
It's still
point
good.
something out because I think it's very, very important. The show Gurren Lagann, and it's something I've seen a lot of the pulp rev guys and the superversives talking about recently. Gurren Lagann accepts its world. It goes wholeheartedly into, like, everybody in the world. The story is real. The stakes are real. They believe in it. They're, you know, this is deadly serious to them. And I think that if it wasn't, the show would fall apart.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the issue.
Yeah,
a lot of this stuff.
That the characters take it so seriously is why the show is so awesome in a lot of ways.
It adds a there's an element of verisimilitude that you can add with hard science fiction, or in my case, I'm actually, because I write more epic fantasy stuff, I'm doing more research into things like HEMA, historical European martial arts. So if someone's using a claymore or a longsword, I actually know what they would be doing with it. And there's all sorts of crazy things. Like there's one technique where it's ending him, as Scalagram mistranslated it, because I've been watching a lot of his videos, as ending him rightly, which is supposed to be ending him quickly. It's a German translation, where you literally unscrew the pommel of your sword, chuck it at the guy's helmet, and then close in for the kill for a judicial fight. But one of the things is you can add an element of verisimilitude for that, but you're not going to be able to, I think you would damage it more if you have your characters not act like the stakes are actually there, where you see a lot of flagrant danger.
You could
these people know it's though, and it doesn't work.
You could wink to an extent. You could wink in the sense like that scene, even that scene, like what makes that scene work is that the characters aren't, you know, they didn't break the fourth wall and look at the audience. They were taking it seriously. Right. The conversation was a real conversation to them.
Right. That's the thing. It's not
all
that
the difference.
Right. It's not that there's never, you know, explanations. And they're now just pointing out, oh, we've never gotten explanations before. It was that, yeah, there'd always be some vaguely, I don't want to say scientific, but some vaguely logical explanation, but they're like, we don't care. Logic to us is just something to punch through. And it's rather entertaining in that sense. But the issue with
Gurren Lagann, I will say this too, Gurren Lagann is a lot smarter than people give it credit for in a lot of ways, because Gurren Lagann, yes, it has that plot that doesn't really make all that much sense. It's just one event going bigger and bigger, one after the other.
It's not non sequitur, but it's kind of close.
I mean, it's sort of like, we're just going to do this and make it bigger. But at the same time, I mean, they have that awesome scene, which it was the best, when they have to escape into space and it's not working and they're getting attacked because the moon is going to be crashing into the Earth. And they don't know what to do. And Simone just goes, isn't it obvious? We need to push the moon back into space. And I just started laughing. And I'm like, that's the greatest thing ever.
And the thing is, they don't like... Yeah, they treat it completely seriously.
It's so earnest, and they're so into it. And it's like, how do you not love that? The point I'm making is that Gurren Lagann has that, but they know what they're doing. They know exactly the type of story they want to tell. They know exactly what sorts of decisions they need to make. Like, yeah, the plot isn't as important to them in the sense of, you know, logic and all of that. However, the characters are very important to them. And Gurren Lagann has great character development. Mm-hmm. When after they beat the Lorgino, the Spiral King, and they cut to years later and they're in Kamina City and Simone is the world leader. Like, the politics of that world and what happens when the disaster hits are actually very well done and very well thought out. They know what they want to do, and they know exactly how to execute it. And the stuff that is less logical, there is a purpose. They've decided we're going to make it awesome before we make it, you know, we're
if you
gonna
make it make complete
sacrifice
sense.
hard sci-fi for awesome.
Right. And that's one of the things, this idea of knowing what you're writing is where I think a lot of, especially authors nowadays, kind of go out of the start falling apart with, oh, I'm writing this book it's going to be all deep and introspective and stuff, and it's not got the framework for that. And the thing is, like, if you want to be super deep and introspective, you actually you can't force that. That has to kind of come naturally, and I don't think everyone can do that. And that's not a riff on people. You can still have elements of depth to your work that can be added. I mean, heck, Robert E. Howard's Conan stuff talks about things like civilization and barbarism and the perils of both. Yeah. But the thing is, it does that in a way that's still exciting and gets your blood pounding, in the way that it doesn't reach the depth of someone like John C. Wright or Gene Wolfe. But then again, nobody nowadays gets to John C. Wright or Gene Wolfe levels.
Gurren Lagann knew exactly what story it wanted to tell until, and I think we need to, before we move on to Brotherhood,
the ending, yes.
We have to talk about this because it's the one great flaw of Gurren Lagann, and John C. Wright wrote a terrific article on it that you can find on his site if you just put in the search bar Gurren Lagann. He put in a whole analysis of the series and why the ending fails. Because we got to talk about this. The disappearance.
The last episode, and this is where we spoil it.
It's a great episode, by the way.
Yes.
Fantastic.
They are fighting at the end. It goes from mechs fighting this monstrous, gigantic city. In the sky. That's the first half of the series. It goes from a bunch of mechs doing that to they've literally grown so large they're chucking galaxies at each other like shurikens, fighting this. They're called the anti-spirals. They're basically think unlife. They're not evolving. They're not changing. They're not growing. They've sterilized themselves, basically, not in the sense of actual.
The only way to prevent the heat death of the universe is to make sure nobody else grows either. And in order to do that, their one great move is that they make their enemies believe that they have a chance to win before pulling the rug out from under them, so that they despair and give up.
Right. It's an almost Thomas Malthusian perspective, and this is something that shows up a lot. Where it's I always call it the lifeboat philosophy, which is we're on a lifeboat. We have limited amounts of resources, so we can't consume this, we can't do that, because we're going to be on a lifeboat adrift forever. Now there are other people who are like, yeah, the thing is, and this is the issue I have with a lot of the very crazy environmentalists, like the people who are just like, I want to recycle more, I think that'd be better for the planet. Yeah, I totally get that. But the guys are like, we need to limit how much we reproduce. We need to limit how much we do that. They're falling into this trap too. The issue is it's this idea of forced rationing when there's not a need at the moment. And
it's even more that
projecting into the future that they can't see.
What their method of defeat is, for most people, perfect. It's going to drive them into despair. But what makes Gurren Lagann different, and what they don't realize, is that it's exactly the way not to fight Gurren Lagann. Because Gurren Lagann does not despair, ever, ever, ever.
I think they're mentally incapable of such things.
Right. So they're the perfect group to take on the anti-spirals, because even when things go bad, they never give up.
Yeah.
This is all going back to Mia, so this is all related. Yeah. We just have to get through the philosophy.
So you have this, important. And I'm not saying it's a philosophy that's as deep as say like talking about Plato's theory of the forms, or the eidos, or things like that, or the concept of a telos, of a chief end of something in Greek philosophy. It's not that deep, but it's the philosophy of the work, and and as such, you don't really want to violate the philosophy of a work, because then you've created something that's discordant with the whole, and that's where the ending comes in. I basically analogize Gurren Lagann as someone doing a high dive, and they do like a triple backflip, all sorts of crazy stuff, except they completely miss the water and crack their head on the pavement at the very end, where it's going great, and they fail to stick the landing in a cataclysmic way.
Because the philosophy of the ending is tonally, utterly, and completely discordant with everything that Gurren Lagann stood for up to that point.
Yeah.
The problem with it, here's the big thing about the ending. So we went into the philosophy of Gurren Lagann is that you can always go bigger. You could always go better. You never give up. You could do anything. And, the catchline of Gurren Lagann is, who the hell do you think I am? Because every time somebody tells them that they can't do something, that's always their response. Because,
and they're just like,
who do you think they are? They could do anything.
They punch one of the anti-spiral things out of their dimension. They hit it so hard it breaks space-time. It's like, and then you get to, oh, we agreed this, we knew this would happen. There's nothing that could be done. It's like, excuse me? This is the person who turned the entire moon into a freaking battle mech. And you're saying you can't fix one person because they have a little issue?
Yeah,
I don't see it.
To get back, really, we should explain exactly what happens here's what happens after the anti-spiral attack. The whole mission was really about about Simone trying to rescue Nia.
She gets kind of possessed by the anti-spirals.
Yeah, she's been kidnapped by the anti-spirals, and they literally find them because Simone uses the power of love to pinpoint her at the far end of the universe, which is fantastic, by the way. But they have this whole thing. They do everything, build it like that. And then they finally have their wedding at the end of the series.
And Nia,
right after the wedding, fades away. She disappears. And they run up, and Simone is looking at this and smiling. And they run up to Simone and they say, you can bring her back though, right? You could do anything. You could reverse entropy, essentially. And Simone ruffles the kid's hair and says, oh no, this is how the world must be. This is the world is for the future, not for us. And it's so tonally discordant with the rest of Gurren Lagann, where they would never accept something like that. If it were me, if I were doing it, and if I really wanted to do that scene, I would do it. And I'd have Simone be upset and everybody watching. And then he would say, one day we're going to do this. I'll bring her back. And then they have an epilogue in the show. You have that epilogue, and I'd show the whole thing with Gurren Lagann going back into space. And then I would cut to Simone with a figure in the window, maybe, that looks like an outline of Nia. And then I would close off the show. Because you can't do that. You can't just have him say, that's it. It has to be that way.
That's not how
what he said before.
That's not just
against his personality.
It's against the entire theme of the show, which is, you say this is how reality works. Our pig-headed stubbornness and will
reject
it. Yeah. I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Which is really exactly what it is. They tell them it has to be this way. This is your destiny. This is your fate. They tell this to Simone all the time, and to Kamina too. And they say, no, you could tell me what you want, but who the hell do you think I am? And now at the ending, his one true love that they cross the universe to find, he's just going to accept that? he's just going to go, oh, yeah, it has to be that way. Never, never, never. It's so discordant. I mean, one other way I thought of it was there was this one scene in, what was it? Age of Ultron, which is a very flawed movie. But there was this wonderful scene at the end of the film where they need to fight Ultron. And somebody goes to Avengers, to Captain America. The problem is that he goes, we're going to have to sacrifice the city in order to save the world and defeat Ultron. And Captain America looks at him and goes, no, that's not an option. It's not happening. We're not doing it. Mm-hmm. And he basically tells him, we're going to do both. I don't know how. I don't care. But sacrificing the city is not an option.
Yeah.
And I love that scene. And that's what it should have been in Gurren Lagann. That sacrificing Nia, just letting her die, is not an option. It's not happening. They reject it. It doesn't matter how logical it is. It doesn't matter how impossible it is, because nothing is ever impossible for Gurren Lagann. Until it is. That's the failure.
That's the thing. It's just this and the thing is, it's not even in the same scale. It's just arbitrary. It's not, oh, this is the one enemy you can't face. It's tiny compared to what they've done. They were literally throwing galaxies back at someone. They punched out an entire freaking planet.
I mean, they're taking punches that they literally say they're more powerful than the Big Bang.
Yeah. And then this is impossible.
But they can't save Nia.
Yeah.
They can't save the girl. I mean, like, it just fits so badly. It's like a sucker punch. Because you watch it and you go, what? After all of that? And it's so disappointing. But I think you have to end the Gurren Lagann discussion on that it's a great show. It truly is. I love Gurren Lagann. It's one of my favorite anime.
It just does not stick the landing.
But those final 2 minutes are so discordant with the rest of the show. It's just really disappointing. With that said, the rest of it is so much fun and so good and so awesome to watch. You got to watch it. Mm-hmm. It's such a great show. It really is.
It does not stick the landing, but everything up till then is a freaking wild ride that's just full of fun.
Yeah.
Now,
it's got to be watched. Now, there's an even better show.
Yes.
That we should talk about. One of my all-time favorites, one of Corey's favorites.
Yep. It's influenced my writing. If anyone here has read Fever Blood, some of the bad guys are somewhat influenced by it. I've shaved off the serial numbers enough so it's not like, oh, you've just taken the homunculi. It's like, no, trust me. I've made sure to cover
Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood
lawsuits or anything, or actually plagiarizing. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now,
I love this show.
Yes, it's really good. It's one of the things is it's very, very lean. Ridiculously so for some anime.
There's a website called animefiller.com, and this show has 65 episodes or something, so it's not a short show, and it has 3% filler.
And I think that would go even lower if you take out one episode, 3%. Because there's one episode that's just a recap episode.
And that's basically the extent of it.
Yeah. There is, because everything ties in. They go to this place and there's this corrupt priest that's lying to the people and using alchemy and a philosopher's stone to simulate miracles. And they expose him as a fraud. And you'd be like, is that just the author trying to make a bash at religion? And it turns out, no, it's somewhat uncharacteristic, but that shows up later. Everything that's mentioned shows up later in a very, very well executed way, where
very intelligent.
Yeah.
And Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, I'll say this: it starts off everybody remembers the original Fullmetal Alchemist. And I know there's a bit of a debate on which one is better. For me, I watched a lot. I didn't quite finish it, but I watched a lot of the original Fullmetal Alchemist. And there is no question for me that Brotherhood is the better show. I actually don't mind the original, although I don't love it, but I don't mind it at all. It's a well done show. It's a lot darker in a lot of ways, to the point where I wonder if certain scenes in Brotherhood were put in there specifically to contrast with decisions made in the original Fullmetal Alchemist.
Like, I'd imagine, because from what I understand, Brotherhood is almost entirely based off of the manga, and that's actually one of the few manga I actually collect is Fullmetal Alchemist. And there's a few things that they edited out, like when they're on the island, when Ed and Al are on the island, and they're, they have to survive for, I think it's like a month or so, and figure out an alchemical truth. In the manga, there's a guy who shows up and like is attacking them, and it turns out he's just one of the Curtis's like work assistants. But
yeah, and he shows up in the first anime, and that's the one thing. The early episodes of the original Fullmetal Alchemist versus Brotherhood, it's hard for me to say because the consensus by at least a lot of people I notice is that the first episodes of the original Fullmetal Alchemist are better than the first episodes of Brotherhood. I actually think that it's a little bit hit and miss. Certain episodes are better, certain episodes are worse. The fight scenes in Brotherhood are much, much better. And I think the big contrast I could say here is the Azumi Curtis sequence. First off, you got to remember that I watched Brotherhood without watching the original FMA. So I have no problem saying that it worked great in Brotherhood. I loved Azumi. She was a great character. I had no issue with the way they did it.
The best
but in the original Fullmetal Alchemist, they probably handled that section a little bit better. But there are other parts that just drag. Like I think where Brotherhood really starts to separate itself as the clearly better show is when they meet Greed. And in the original, they have this long, long, long conversation with Greed, and Azumi shows up, and they keep talking and talking while they prepare to fight. And then King Bradley and the rest of the people show up to interrupt the fight. And Greed literally has a line where he says, "Oh, looks like our fight's not going to happen after all." And my jaw dropped because they spent like 2 or 3 episodes on this, and there was no fight, just talking and talking. And in Brotherhood, they have that same sequence, a lot leaner, and there is a fight scene. There is an awesome fight scene, actually. It's a terrific fight scene with Creed.
Yeah, with what's his face? With Elric. Edward Elric. Using his alchemy to turn Greed's super shield, because for those of you who aren't terribly familiar, he gets this like weird black and red shield all over his body, like another skin that's made up of this weird carbon structure that basically makes him invincible with like diamond skin. And Edward figures out, oh, this thing probably made up of carbon, which is like the most abundant material in the body. So he turns it into graphite. So he punches him, and it like this strips off the shield and his skin. But
I should also, one thing that we didn't bring up, we should summarize briefly the plot just in case somebody doesn't know it. Even though you should not be listening to this if you don't know it. But
you are,
because it's gonna ruin lots of things that I bring up later.
Basically,
but anyway, go ahead.
The basic plot is Edward and Alphonse Elric are 2 brothers who are alchemists, where they can manipulate matter. The key, manipulate matter and reshape it. The issue with that is you have to both sacrifice a proportional amount of matter, which is the law of equivalent exchange, which means that certain practices are forbidden. One of them is human transmutation, trying to bring someone back from the dead. Because, yes, you can get all the parts for their body, but what are you going to pay for their soul? You can't. There's like nothing that you can actually use for that. And as such, pretty much every attempt at human transmutation is doomed to rebound, where you don't actually have enough material, and it takes something from you.
Horribly wrong.
Horribly wrong. So Edward loses
after the death of their mother.
Yes, their mother dies. These two brothers try to bring her back. It doesn't end well. Edward loses his arm and his leg. Alphonse loses his entire body, but ends up getting his soul bonded to a suit of armor. Alphonse is the younger brother. Edward's the older brother. And they're trying to find this thing called the Philosopher's Stone to bring their bodies back. The problem is they discover that the Philosopher's Stone is, to be frank, made up of murdered souls sucked out of people's bodies, because there's nothing that can equal them in price, so to speak. So you can make pretty much anything out of them. But obviously these guys aren't going to just, use a bunch of dead people to make their bodies.
Grows and grows and grows from there.
Yeah, you get these
and there
guys.
Are so many subplots and like 30-something characters who all have really established personalities and get their day in the sun, and it's just wonderful.
It does the opposite of what a George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire does, where he has a lot of characters where you can't remember them all. He has charts in the back where it's like all these noble houses and all their pages and all their knights and lords and stuff. You need that because the cast of characters is too big to remember, and they're not, and they start to kind of blend together. Like, I read the first two books, and the bad guys of Joffrey and Viserys started to kind of seem like the same character to some extent. But
I could rattle off the characters of Fullmetal Alchemist.
Oh yeah,
know exactly who they are.
Right. The issue with
appear briefly.
Yeah. The thing that Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood does well is it introduces them all. It keeps them all consistent, which apparently is something that Martin's having issues with. Where I've heard rumors that he has someone whose job is basically just keep track of all of these characters. And they keep it consistent, and then they also introduce them in ways that fit. You have, for example, you introduce all these characters that say when they go to Fort Briggs, and it works so well because everyone shows up for the grand finale, and it doesn't feel
Oh, the finale is amazing. How that she managed to get so many characters their day in the sun and made it work. Like it never felt shoehorned in. It felt like they all had to be there. They all had a reason to be there. And the story would have suffered if they weren't there. Like, nobody was just stuffed there.
Right.
And that was one of the really great things about
they kill off some
characters. But kill off a few.
The thing I think happens with Martin is I think he's trying to kill off tons of characters, because otherwise he's got to cull the herd, so to speak. He's got way too many. He's got to get a bunch of them off. When these guys have characters die, they might die in the last season, which is pretty much what we're talking about with the entire finale. The day of the invasion, so to speak, is like the entire last 12 episodes, because there's just so much that happens there, yet it still feels like it's going at a breakneck pace. You have characters die there, but it works. It fits.
Who dies? Greed, Captain Buccaneer. Who dies? And Wrath, King Bradley. Wrath dies. And
spoiler alert.
Somebody else I'm missing. Father.
Oh, there's obviously him. I know a bunch of the
time too.
Yeah, a bunch of the generals die.
Although afterward, he dies afterward technically, but
it's still last season. But you have a bunch of what you have with theirs. You have a bunch of characters that are introduced, and they're all done very well. I especially like the way they did the villains, because there's these 7 villains, the 7 homunculi, and they're all based off of the 7 deadly sins. And you would expect them all to act in certain ways, but they become an exploration of what that sin is, what it means, what it becomes. And there's a very easy way to do it, to make these guys almost caricatures of, greed, make him excessively greedy. And he constantly says how greedy he is. You don't see him, diving in the Scrooge McDuck bathtub full of gold coins, though. You see, for example, for greed, there's one thing that he wants that he can't take. He can have everything else. He can have money, women, power, all the wants of the flesh, except one thing. The one thing you can't actually steal or take or buy, and that's a friend.
Right, a real friend.
Right.
That's something, you can't grab it, you can't steal it, because if it's a real friend, they're the ones who need to choose it.
Right. And the thing is, the greed ends up, and here's another spoiler, ends up getting reabsorbed into Father, the big bad guy of the series, except on the way down, being reabsorbed into Father, he changes up, sacrifices himself to turn Father's body from the invincible shield to brittle, like graphite, and starts causing him to like crumble. And greed ends up literally getting ripped out of Father and destroyed. But he's basically
he has the great heroic sacrifice at the end.
Yeah, and no greater love has he than to lay his life down for a friend, I believe. I probably mangled the quote, but
you're close.
Yeah,
that's about right. But anyway,
it's the whole that's the whole thing. He's the only one of the homunculi to actually become what we would almost consider a good guy, not a hero, but on the good guy side. And how does he do it? He doesn't do it by taking and stealing everything. He doesn't do it by giving into this, and he overcomes it. He gives up everything for a friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone else.
And he gives up everything, but he gains friends. So he has everything he ever really wanted.
Right, and with all of the other characters.
Wonderful about that character arc.
All of the other homunculi, where they fell apart was when I say where they fell apart, I don't mean in the story sense, but where they actually died or got defeated was when they did not overcome their sins, but they succumbed to them. Lust, for example, this was the one where the easy way to do it would be basically to make her want to sleep with everything in sight. They didn't. She was
a femme fatale to an extent.
Oh, definitely. The thing is, a femme fatale is not uncontrollable like lust. Like the lust, not in the sense of the character, but in the sense of.
In fact, it was very controlled.
That's how a femme fatale works. Is the idea of a femme fatale is they're using and Raymond Chandler, the author of The Big Sleep, Farewell My Lovely, and The High Window, or is it Farewell My Lady? He does this very well, because he kind of created the noir tough guy. Him and Dashiell Hammett created it. The femme fatale uses her feminine charms and her grace, her sexuality, her sensuality as a weapon. How to manipulate people with that. And think that's what she is, a femme fatale. She manipulated Gene Havoc into that. Yeah. She manipulated him and ended up the thing that the issue is there that's not lust. Then that's there's a deviousness to that, but that doesn't qualify as lust. She suffers from bloodlust instead of, physical carnal lust. She
Well, the
suffers
other
from
thing, like all the
she
homunculi, she gets an ironic death because who does she lose to? You have Colonel Mustang, who at least in that point of the series is known as a womanizer, and he dies protecting the only woman he ever actually cared about in Hawkeye.
Yeah.
So she gets an ironic death.
Yeah, but think about the other thing when people talk about the idea of lust. It's burning up with passion. I believe Paul talks about that in the Bible. And I'm not saying it's a biblical reference, but it's just a reference that's so common with the nature of how lust works. Basically, you're burning with passion is how everyone says it, and she literally gets burned to death by Mustang, which is the freaking most. That was the moment where Roy Mustang changed, because we're getting a friend of ours to watch this series, and one of the things he says is they're making Mustang kind of that the butt monkey of all the jokes.
Well, I would say he starts getting a little more. You start to see that he's putting on a bit of an act, that this is, he's smarter than he appears after the Maria Ross incident.
Yeah,
but
this is
the
where
episode, the fight against lust, I think that the show starts getting better when we hit greed, and the fight against lust is the point where it really grows the beard and it becomes great.
Oh yeah,
and everything past that is great, and I think that's probably the best episode of the entire show. Is the fight against lust.
Yeah.
And
there was two characters.
So much going on there. The other thing too that you need to understand, when I watched this show, I did not know I didn't know the story of Fullmetal Alchemist. I didn't know how big of a character Mustang would become, or Hawkeye, or anything.
I didn't either. So
it's crazy. They have that scene where Mustang is stabbed and Havoc is stabbed and they're left in a pool of blood. And I thought Mustang was dead. Like, I was convinced he was dead.
And then he shows up with a lighter.
When he shows up,
carved
he has that great line where he goes, "Well spoken," and he burns her. And he goes, "I got you on your knees after all," which, by the way, is another lust reference.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, he has that fantastic line. Then she's like, she goes, "How did you survive?" And he's going, "I burned my wound shot." Yeah. He almost passed out.
I freaking scored my hand up to make the transmutation circles, because in the world, that's how it works. You have to create this circle and this weird matrix inside it to order your alchemy with a few people who can go off. He cuts that into his own hand
to create a transmutation circle. And then he burned his own wound shot to cauterize it.
Yeah, using a lighter for a spark. Because he's for those unaware, he uses flame alchemy. I think the way that someone described it is he manipulates water, and not water. He manipulates air to create clouds of pure oxygen. Which, if you guys don't know, pure oxygen is very flammable. If you're in a room of pure oxygen, you spark a match, it will explode. But the way that he does that, it works really well. Now, there are two homunculi I really didn't like. There was gluttony, because they kind of just made him eat everything. And I also just did not like the character design, because he was kind of weird and creepy looking.
Well, that was kind of the point. He was supposed to look creepy, but look, I'll put it to you. Yeah, I'll put it this way. The other homunculi, they had depth beyond their surface appearances, their roles in the story, and Gluttony and Sloth were fine in the sense that they fulfilled their role in the story well, but there wasn't really anything to them beyond that.
Right.
Although Sloth, I thought, had a sort of tragedy to him in his own way, but not at the level of the others.
But no, he can't sleep. The issue with that is the way that they're all taken out. However, Sloth is just basically battered into abandon.
Well, yeah, of course, the thing with Sloth, the ironic death of Sloth, is that his is the longest and most drawn-out battle. It's also, by the way, an awesome battle. And Sig shows up and he goes, impeccable valor.
Oh yeah, that's just
muscle.
Colonel Armstrong. Is it Major Armstrong?
Yeah, Major Armstrong, the strong arm alchemist.
Yeah, he's ridiculously hammy, and then you meet his sister, who's just psycho. Is the best way to put her. She's a fascinating character. She's well designed, and she's just terrifying.
Yeah, very. A lot of the characters in Fullmetal Alchemist are over the top, which is fine. I mean, that's not an insult at all. They're very
element of romanticism, the literary movement, not in the sense of we're romanticizing things, but romanticism has larger than life characters, crazy stakes, over the top. It can go over the top, but it's if you look
in
at
a specific way.
Mm-hmm. But the yeah, Sloth's battle was ridiculously drawn out. Gluttony was devoured by pride after both of them were.
Yeah, so Gluttony was devoured. Lust was taken down by a known womanizer protecting the only woman he actually cared about.
Yeah.
What else was there? Pride was reduced to an infant child. Literally,
after the foul and gross human who is like, we're totally superior to you, turns himself into a makeshift philosopher's stone and just rips the crap out of him.
Yeah, and he's turned into a child, literally the most pathetic, most helpless thing possible. So that's Pride's ironic ending. To an infant, I should say.
Yeah.
Because he was already kind of a child, but to an infant.
Turns into almost like an infant fetus thing at the very end.
Yeah.
And he grows
so literally the most helpless thing possible is what Pride turns into. It also has that amazing scene with Kimberly, and I think that's also worth talking about because I watched the whole video on it. That was great. And it really helped sell the character of Kimberly for me and how that whole scene made sense. Now, Kimberly has one aspect about him that's kind of admirable, I should say, is that his philosophy is very consistent. He believes he is a nihilist in the most pure sense. And he's the person, when Hawkeye is in the middle of the Ishvalan Civil War, he's the one who calls her and who calls Mustang, I guess later, it affects him, their hypocrisy. How Hawkeye said she doesn't want to be here. And he says, you didn't have to be here. You volunteered. You knew when you joined the army that this was a possibility. And don't lie and say that you didn't enjoy it to an extent. You didn't enjoy the fact that you had to make this impossible shot and you were able to do it. And the reason that Kimberly joins the homunculi isn't necessarily because he believes in their mission, because he doesn't really believe in anything, but because he believes there's no such thing as morality, just power. And he thinks the homunculi are going to be more powerful. And he wants to see if they can pull it off, if that's really what's going to happen. So when Kimberly is absorbed by Pride, most of the souls who Pride absorbs, who any homunculi absorb, turn into this writhing torment. They, scream
Kimberly remains whole.
Yeah.
And then
they lose their individuality, or at least you think they do. Hohenheim challenges that. He kind of proves that that's not really the case. The homunculi just aren't interested in hearing it. But Kimberly manages to break himself free from the other people who are stuck in this torment, who can't break themselves out and make themselves known as individuals. Because Kimberly, this is actually being sucked into Pride, isn't actually the worst fate for Kimberly, because it keeps him alive to see what will happen. So when Pride turns himself, doesn't he start absorbing a human? And that was his thing.
He starts trying to absorb Edward. And then Edward, instead of trying to resist, turns himself into a philosopher's stone of one soul and just proceeds to like go through and wreck everything after Kimberly starts
and
messing with
Kimberly,
Pride.
what happens with Kimberly is that he manages to keep his sanity because this is what Kimberly wanted to see. He's in the position that he really wanted to be in all along. And while he wouldn't want to be a philosopher's stone, the fact that he's there still gives him the opportunity to know what will happen next. And that's all he ever really wanted. But when Pride starts absorbing Edward, he realizes that the homunculi need the humans, not the other way around. That the homunculi aren't stronger than humans.
They can't reproduce. They can't create anything, so to speak.
And they need humans to survive. When he sees Pride absorbing Edward, he turns on the homunculi because it was never about them. It was about the power and about who was more powerful. And when he sees that the homunculi aren't more powerful, then he has contempt for them. He doesn't. He wants them to lose.
They're hypocrites in their own way.
Yeah, Pride is a hypocrite. Pride is going. He talks about his superiority to humans, and then he goes to absorb a human. And if there's one thing Kimberly hates, if there's one thing Kimberly hates, it's hypocrisy.
Yeah, and you can't claim to be superior to something you're dependent on.
Yes, he hates hypocrisy. And that's why in that scene with Edward, he turns on Pride because he sees that Edward is consistent and Pride is the hypocrite. And he's not really more powerful. So that's what makes Kimberly an interesting character. Nothing with him is personal.
Mm-hmm. So with the other homunculi, you have, so we did lust, sloth, gluttony, because gluttony ends up getting consumed.
Gluttony's even. It's not difficult.
Yeah,
but
greed.
Greed's ironic death is that Greed wants everything in the world, and he sacrifices himself and gives up the world after gaining the one thing that he really wanted, which was friends.
Right.
Which, by the way, sounds so corny, but it actually works really, really well.
Yeah.
When you say it out loud, it sounds really corny.
Think about it like this. It's the idea of respect. You can't get respect. You have to earn respect. And
people's love, the love of his friends.
Right. And I went with something almost similar with the bad guy in my novel Fever Blood, where the bad guy is based off of I base my bad guys off of the 7 deadly sins, and then I throw in the sin of the 9th circle of hell, treachery. And I mixed that in, and I wasn't thinking I'm going to write my own version of Fullmetal Alchemist before anyone decides to jump on that. But the way I tried to do the bad guy Kazalabad, the avaricious, it wasn't that he wanted jewels or money or power or stuff like that. He wanted people. He wanted, like, the whole thing that my bad guy does is he has the ability to see that basically the price of someone's soul. What can he offer you to earn your undying allegiance? And he goes in and he likes being able to buy off people. The problem is there's some people who he can't buy off. And those people send him into a furious rage because that's that's how he tries to find his meaning. That's how he tries to find his that's how he basically tries to function, by buying off people. And you kind of have the opposite of that with greed, where instead of trying to buy someone's admiration, which you can't do, because you can't make it genuine then, or if you even if you can, you would never know. With greed, you have him give up everything. He's the only one of the homunculi who overcomes his sin to become something greater, as opposed to everyone else succumbing. Now, the other two you had were envy and wrath. And wrath was pretty simple in his ironic death. He was killed by Scar.
He was killed by Scar, who overcame his wrath, and then he dies at peace.
Yeah.
And they mention that. They specifically point that out.
He looks like he died peacefully, which is not something you'd think of with a wrathful individual. And he's slain by someone who has had incredible hatred, incredible, like, and I would almost say somewhat justified anger at what has been done to him and his people.
And he's overcome it.
Yes, he's managed to forgive, put it aside, and basically cleanse himself of the danger that is, because that kind of hatred, that kind of anger, it's probably one of the most addictive poisons to the human soul. It feels so good, but no matter what happens, because you see people who are overcome with this anger, you see it, who are overcome with this anger, this hatred, they are like, this righteous indignation comes over them, and they are almost consumed by this. It just feels so good to them, but they don't realize it's slowly killing them. And Scar managed to put that away from himself to, ironically, in a non-wrathful, non-vengeful way, exacting vengeance on the man who ordered his people exterminated. You think about that.
Yeah, that was Wrath. Are we missing anything?
Envy. The
Envy.
Best fight with Colonel Mustang.
Well, maybe. I don't know if I call it a fight so much as a beatdown.
It was, oh boy, was that. It was, you had Mustang nearly go over the edge, but what was the, and Envy was always, it was odd because you never see him that envious. You see lust in her bloodlust because she's so quick to just kill someone. You see Wrath where he just, once he lets out his wrath, someone's going to die. There's no other option but someone dies. In the case of Wrath, like, he can't, once he lets that part of himself loose, someone is going to die. There's no way he can control himself after that. With Envy, you don't see that so much. He just is an arrogant SOB at first, until he finally, basically, Edward just looks at him like, now I get it. You're envious of humans, and he doesn't believe it. He doesn't, but it's exactly what it is, because these are he's trying to get people to fight and kill each other, when these people, Scar, Edward, Mei Chang, all these guys have set aside their differences, and that's one of the things is the basis of envy. And I was talking with Josh Young in the Superversive Discord channel, a private channel we have, about different nature of different types of sins as I was writing this. And the nature, I would say, of greed, gluttony, and envy are kind of similar, because they both kind of gather around gathering materials. And gluttony, I kind of abstract beyond just eating everything, but greed is the desire almost to hoard, to collect things, and to gather things, to have them. That's the focus of the sin, is not
right.
Well, gluttony is gathering excess, not to hoard but to consume. So, you can be a glutton for video games, say, if you're constantly getting them just to play through them. You can be a glutton for all sorts of things. But envy is not as much a desire to gain, to have something. It's not for you, so to speak, but it's to deprive someone else of something. You don't want to have a car like your neighbor's. You want to have your neighbor's car so they don't have it. It's
right.
I think greed meets resentment, in the sense that you don't like the fact that somebody else has something, and you have to. An envious person, I would think, if they're consumed by envy, if, say, they would go out every day, they'd be driving to work, and they'd look over the neighbor, and he has this gorgeous, like, Ferrari, the envious person would not like be horrendously like heartbroken if they never got the Ferrari, but they wrecked it for the other guy. If they got their own Ferrari, that wouldn't help them. It's not about them having stuff. It's about depriving other people of stuff. And you see that with envy, where he's constantly trying to get people to fight, where he's constantly trying to basically tempt people into acting like monsters. And it's not because he's envious of humans and their ability to have relationships and stuff, because he never really has one. The closest thing he has is to the other homunculi, and he's not. Even then, he's rather cold.
Yeah, envy. Mustang says before he.
That's another story.
Before Mustang makes his final blow with envy, he says, "Oh, I see now. You're pitiful, and envy is and jealousy is a pitiful thing." And he's right, and that's why after he loses the fight the Mustang, he kills himself. He has always, he hates humans. He wants, he despises humans, and he wants to be a human, and he never could. Now he's a slug. He's not even humanoid. So he can never recover from that. So there isn't even really a point on living once you're there.
Right.
So
it's
envy.
Mm-hmm. And it's that way that it's done, that basically it takes it and completely basically shows the nature of resentment. And that's one of the things that I tend to see a lot in my own writing. Not resentment, but the idea of having bad guys motivated by resentment, because it's a major sin. It was pride, and I would say resentment, that cast the devil out of heaven.
Yeah, pride is the worst of the 7 deadly sins.
Right. And I would say that an element of resentment was present too, because if you look at the way that some people act, you see people become monsters because they're resenting someone else. And it was just like it was just fascinating to watch, because there's a very easy way to do this, where you could have envy be jaded and bitter about everybody, because he's obviously just envious of everyone and all constantly complaining and bickering. But he doesn't. Instead, what he does is he puts on this facade of arrogance and this facade of where he just assumes he's superior to everyone else. And he doesn't. He isn't. He can look like anybody. He can be anyone, except for the fact that he can't actually be them. He can just look like them in that sense.
Right, exactly. And that's why, too, what makes Wrath is interesting in a similar way. Like a lot of the homunculi, he doesn't embody it in the way that a lot of people
It's not the stereotypical version.
He's controlled Wrath. He is in check. He is able to hold it in, and then when he unleashes it, he is an incredibly powerful fighter.
But he's not. Here's the thing. When Wrath is unleashing it, he's not controlled. You've never seen him not kill somebody. If he goes after someone, you've never seen him incapacitate someone. The only instance where that happens is if the other person runs away. You see that with Greed, and you see that with Scar to some extent, where Scar actually kills him.
Ling puts on Ling is one of the only people actually who puts up a pretty good fight against Wrath, which is pretty impressive of Ling. It shows Ling is actually a better fighter than I think a lot of people notice in the show. That he's able to go toe-to-toe.
Ling acts like the butt of all jokes when you first meet him, because he's eating everything. He's pretending he doesn't speak the language. Yeah. just
Getting lost,
walking
passing.
into a guy's place like he owns the place. But that's not actually how he is. That's the thing, is the characters are so well defined, and then I should say everything about it's really, really well defined, in the sense that the magic system, it works. From what I understand of the original FMA anime, they had to come up with this idea of equivalent exchange that just doesn't work. That when they come up with it, it violates the.
Well, that's where I say I
rule.
wonder if certain things in Brotherhood were just mentioned even to contrast specifically with the original series. Like Edward and Al specifically make a point of saying we will never sacrifice ourselves for the other one, when that is
Right.
exactly what happens at the ending of the original Fullmetal Alchemist. Or the whole thing with Lior, with the corrupt priest. In the original Fullmetal Alchemist, they go back to Lior, and Lior is in shambles.
Now,
And
here
the
they're
character, I
rebuilding
think
it.
it was Rebecca Rose,
Right.
thank you. The character of Rose in in Fullmetal Alchemist, in the original, she is like was abused and mute and probably raped, and it's such a contrast to. I wonder if they added that scene where Hohenheim goes to Lior and he finds Rose, and Rose is in a good place and they're rebuilding the town, and Ed
Just
has kind of
despite that, yeah.
and Ed has kind of become a folk hero. I have no proof of this, but I wonder if she added that scene
Arakawa?
contrast with, to
I
confirm.
I would not be surprised,
Yeah,
because
just
it
to
gives
confirm, like, yeah, that's not what happened here.
because the manga and Brotherhood, they do get dark. I mean, Shao Tucker, enough said about that.
Although even Shao Tucker in the original, Tucker survives and appears again. So the original is definitely darker in a lot of ways, but Brotherhood
but it still has that. It still has, like, there's certain rules that these guys don't violate, and Gurren Lagann fails in that sense because it violates the one rule, which is never back down from a fight, never back down from a challenge.
Well, yeah.
Fullmetal Alchemist has a few rules about how the magic works, which is you have to sacrifice something of equal value to gain something of said value, and it explains how these different things work. And one of the interesting things that they do at the very end, I don't know if you've caught this, but when you have Father, the dwarf in the flask, Ed and Al, and I think Izumi at one point, you see this, show up facing the truth. And you look at the doors that they have behind them. Edward and Alphonse's have two things that have to do with Kabbalistic and some like hermetic alchemical practices and stuff. I think Izumi had something similar, where the actual designs on the door are from like actual alchemical stuff. I believe there was alchemical or occult or various hermetic traditions, except for truth. Except for Father, the dwarf in the flask. His door is entirely blank.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
I did not know that.
The and I think that the different designs kind of speak to something more. I'd have to look into that more, because I believe it's the Sephiroth or something. I'm not terribly familiar with that. That Edward has, that's supposed to be kind of this mystical pathway that you're supposed to ascend to become like a godlike being in Kabbalistic traditions. I could be completely wrong about that, but I believe that's how it's supposed to work. Everyone has something, but the dwarf in the flask, but Father has nothing on there, and The other thing, the little speech that the father says to the truth at one point, where it's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I was only trying to seek perfection. How did he do it?
That's a great scene, because to make the dwarf in the flask, to make Father a sympathetic character was a really, really well done.
You mean, what do you mean? How do you make it? How do you not make a sympathetic character? The dude who wants to suck the souls out of everyone in an entire country
and eat God.
Yeah. But how does he try to seek perfection? He tries to remove elements of himself.
Sins.
Yeah, he casts out the flaws instead of what I would say is a more stoic option, which is discipline yourself and overcome them.
Instead of overcoming his flaws, he tries to cast them out.
He runs away from them. He creates other demons, so to speak, in the other homunculi.
Yeah, it doesn't work. The thing is that the 7 deadly sins are exaggerations of good traits, which you see especially in the character of greed, but being proud of yourself is bad in excess. Everything about 7 deadly sins is about excess, and he casts them out completely.
Or extreme lack, because if you never consume anything, if you go the opposite end of gluttony, you're going to starve to death. Hunger is a natural thing. Lust, if you don't, ever have any lusts, one, I could argue, in the sense of lust being, experiencing and enjoying something, and this is from a Christian perspective, God made the world, a material world. He made things in it that are good. He made gardens. He made or aromatic flowers. He made food. He made the two sexes to have this, to be able to engage in these things, to not just to reproduce, but in a good sense. If you go the opposite way, one, you're gonna kind of not be able to experience some of these good things. You're also gonna not help the human race continue on. But
the other thing about Father is that by casting out these sins, he doesn't understand humanity at all. That's why when he says he's trying to achieve perfection, it just doesn't work.
Right. Because the thing is, by recognizing your flaws, we recognize we're not going to be perfect, not in this lifetime. And it's the one thing I would say to that is I don't want to say it's a slippery slope, but you'll get people who will go, and they'll use it as almost an anti-religious aspect, where it's these are the things that make us human. Therefore, anyone trying to criticize it or anything, it's bad, and you shouldn't criticize these things. That's not gonna work, but you have to recognize that we are flawed as people, and the way, in the sense of and I guess the Judeo-Christian perspective is we overcome it with the grace of Christ, or by adhering to the law in the Jewish perspective. In the Stoic element, which is one of the philosophies that's one of the Greek philosophies and Roman philosophies eventually, that becomes pretty compatible with Christianity up to a certain point. You can go pretty extreme with that, with Stoicism. Their idea was moral training and discipline was how you improve as a person. Not running away from a moral fight, but embracing the fight and realizing you have to be the victor in this case. And I remember hearing someone talk about the idea of I believe it's a Carl Jungian philosophy, the idea of integrating one's shadow, the idea of the darker parts of oneself. And it's people always think that's oh, you have to embrace your evil side. No, you have to embrace the fact that you can be a bad person. You have to embrace the fact that you can be dangerous, but you have to understand that you can control that. You cannot be a bad
Right.
person.
That's what Father got wrong. That the dwarf in the flask got wrong. That what he did was try and cast out his sins, but by casting out his sins, he's also casting out a major part of human nature. If he really wanted to achieve perfection, he would have moderated his sins.
Right. The idea of the shadow and right. The idea of the shadow, and this is actually something I have one character do. There are people who basically give themselves over to it, and they basically become monstrous in a sense because they'll just do whatever they want. And then you have the people who go the opposite way, who will in this idea of not embracing but integrating your shadow, where they'll try to completely reject it, and they almost become, I don't want to say pathetic, but they become dangerous in a different way because you have to understand you're capable of hurting someone in order to not hurt them.
And that's
like
where
Father
totally lacks empathy, that he's willing to hurt all of these people, but you almost get the sense that it's not really malicious.
He's
just he's gonna do it. He doesn't really care either way.
And that's one of the things. I practice martial arts, and one of the things, and it seems almost like a paradox, but that I would say that the more someone practices martial arts, the more they understand how much they could hurt someone, the less fights they'd ever get in. Like I've never actually, like I've sparred, I've been beaten up in that sense. I've gotten some people who are rough sparring partners, but I've never like gotten into a fight with someone else because I know what I'm capable of. I know what they're capable of. I'm not going to be threatened by that. But what the issue with the shadow, this idea of integrating your shadow, is not all elements of the shadow are bad. Aggression, for example, is one thing constantly equated with that. Basically, it gives you claws, and sometimes claws are pretty freaking useful in some instances. Sometimes you have to be aggressive, and if you cut that part out of you entirely, you can't. You're lacking in some sense, and you're weakening yourself. And that's, I think, part of what Father did, was by cutting out these flaws, the common struggles that people have. He lost his ability to empathize. He lost realizing what would be wrong with doing anything.
Exactly. And we are getting close to a half hour late, so we should probably wrap this up.
So I will basically sum up will I say prognosis on Gurren Lagann?
It's too bad, because I would have liked to talk more about the characters in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, because there's a ton to talk about.
There's tons of them. They're all well done.
That's what influenced my writing the most, that she was able to create such a large cast of characters, and I realized how important that is for epic fantasy. And I would have liked to talk more about how it works as an epic fantasy, but we've got to wrap up.
Maybe another time. Maybe we talk about it sometime. But so basically, for for Gurren Lagann, the pros, it's crazy. It's madness, but it's tons of fun. The cons, I would say, if you're looking for scientific accuracy or something restrained, not going to be here. And they really do not stick the landing. Everything up to the last 5 minutes is excellent, and then they completely, stab their series in the back. Fullmetal Alchemist, it's I will say, for cons, because there's fewer of these, it gets pretty dark in some cases. I mentioned a character named Shadow Tucker. If you know what that is, if you know who that is, yes. Really bad.
I know people who feel at that point, because that's such an insane scene.
Yeah, I had to take a break from watching it after that. And it gets pretty dark. I know some people aren't. It gets kind of, I don't want to say bloody in the sense of it's a gore film, but if you don't like any actual nasty violence, there's some pretty. It can get pretty intense sometimes. But pros, all the characters are really excellently well rendered. The world feels very real. entire story goes. It starts off, and I thought it would go with this, with the Ishval and Civil War, be like go to the whole idea of, you know, racism is bad, because that's usually how people go when they write stories about a genocide of a certain race.
Yeah, but it was so much deeper than
it didn't. Well, it touched on that. It's not like it completely ignored that, but it went beyond that, where it's not that racism just stayed at that surface level, but it went to, why do we do certain things, including things like racism and genocide? Why would these things happen? And it has a depth to it. I wouldn't say it's Christian. It has elements,
but it's anti-scientism too.
Yes,
the concept of scientism.
It's not. I wouldn't say it's like. I wouldn't even say it's Gnostic either. It's really odd, but it's really well done. And I totally recommend it to anyone. Just there's some things that are rather dark in it. So if that's not exactly your cup of tea, you might not want to, but I would say you're missing out on a lot. Anyway, this has been the Whippersnappers podcast, offering a youthful perspective on science fiction and fantasy. We will see you in the future.
Adios.